Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome, and thank you for being here. My name is Madeleine van Holzen. I'm editor-in-chief of Le Temps, a Swiss media, and we're here today to have this discussion about this very important topic, reskilling revolution, enabling a business imperative. I'm very happy to welcome our panelists, and we'll start with you presenting them to you with you, Tan Kok Yam. You are Chief Executive Officer of Skills Future Singapore. So that's a governmental agency working, enabling individuals to learn for life. Minister Ahmad Belloul, Minister of Education of United Arab Emirates. We have also Melanie Parker. You are Chief Diversity Officer at Google, and Shravan Goli, Chief Operating Officer at Gosal. Thank you very much for being here. So maybe I will start with just a few elements to frame the discussion. We know now that more than 1 billion jobs are likely to be radically transformed by technology by the year 2030. The World Economic Forum's Future of Jobs report estimates that more than half of the global workforce might need reskilling or upskilling to remain productive in their current role. At the same time, of course, new technologies are creating millions of new jobs, and for these jobs, the right skills remain in a critically short supply. So there's a supply problem too. So obviously a strong business case for reskilling and upskilling, and maybe one more figure here is that 2/3 of the employers, according to the same report, expect a return on investment in 1 year. So investing in skills, and they want in 1 year results. Okay, I see you, I see your face already on that one. We'll come back we'll come back to that. And of course, so one way to looking at this topic is to look at the questions of barriers to entry. So how do we get more people to these jobs, given that there's so high needs? So maybe we'll just jump into the discussion and start at the beginning with education. Because that's where it starts, and maybe it starts very early also. And if you may, I would start with you, Minister Belloul. So what is the role education and education institutions, what should they play in facilitating a better match between the graduates' education and the jobs?
So I think, look, when it comes to education, there has always been a gap between educational outcomes and labor market requirements. But historically, that was just more of a short-term labor market versus supply of talent gap. What we're talking today about is something fundamentally different. We're talking about graduating students today that will be ready for jobs in the future. That's quite a different perspective. So as educators, we are tackling both at the same time. So I think the first one is a bit easier because you get direct feedback from HR managers today on what they require. Right? And all you have to do is to make sure that all your academic institutions embed these skills. Now, when it comes to the longer-term, future-ready skills, it's quite difficult for two reasons. One, not only being able to predict, but even if you're able to predict, if you look at the numbers, they keep changing. So we just saw the announcements today about the most relevant skills, and empathy is number 10. I think the technical skills are number 4 and 6. The same list 5 years ago, if you not World Economic Forum, coding was on the highest. So we're not even sure yet what skills are required in the future. So with that in mind, what we think about as educators is to not worry too much specifically on which skill is the highest. Is it emotional capabilities and capacity? Is it coding? Is it whatever it may be? But focus on graduating students that will be lifelong learners, that will be highly adaptable, and you have to prepare them today to know that their jobs will drastically change. I think that's the best thing you could do. So how do we do it? We start introducing self-learning much earlier in this process. So historically, you'd be a self-learner in university, then it came down to high school. Now trying as much as we can to get students to self-learn and do more assignments and do some more individualized learning earlier on to instill that capacity of self-learning. And also giving much more electives, even within high schools and earlier on. So you want to push that responsibility more to the student by allowing them to take choices at an early age and allow them to self-learn at a younger age. And today, with the proliferation of digital technology, it becomes much easier to provide digital content as opposed to telling that child to go just read a book and summarize it. So I think in summary, our goal is to make students much more future-proof by making them highly adaptable, instilling a culture of curiosity and a growth mindset, knowing that when they toss their hats when they graduate, they're putting on another hat of lifelong learning.
Thank you very much. Could you give us maybe one example of a measure that you really implemented in order to go into that direction?
Yes, so we've done a couple of things. One is we have dictated on universities to provide courses post-graduation for alumni. So they need to provide reskilling or upskilling courses for their graduates in order to be able to operate in the UAE. Now, we've given them a grace period for a number of years. What we found out is that it was a bit challenging for them because academics, they might update their content at university, but that might not be relevant to you or to me who graduate 10 years later. So we're trying to get them to work much more closely with the private sector. This needs to be not a highly academic, but also a very industry-relevant course. That's one thing that we have done. Two, we've also introduced the job insurance. So if somebody gets laid off, they get the insurance to stay on the job for 6 months to be able to re-skill themselves. Three, we're also putting incentives for employers to train their employees. So I have a program called NAFIS, which means compete. There's a budget there as well to reskill unemployed citizens who are unemployed due to a skills mismatch. So they get a chance to either get trained in whatever skill set required by the employer.
Thank you. Maybe, yes, I was going to give you the floor because we're talking of lifelong learning. So what is your vision of how this has to be implemented?
Yeah, certainly. So I was just going to add on certain points, but I will kind of bring up to the bigger question here. I think why we are here today is clearly the technology is changing rapidly, and I think we've all talked about for the last few years how automation and globalization have been disrupting and displacing some of the jobs for those people without graduate degrees. And of course, the tremendous rise of generative AI is putting risk of all of our jobs in this room here as well as sort of the next wave of what's coming at us. But I think one of the interesting findings from the Future of Jobs report based on the Coursera data is what we found is individuals without degrees can actually acquire critical skills in a comparable time frame with those with degrees. So that is amazing because I think it unlocks an immense opportunity for us to think of it as a skills-based training and skills-based hiring. I think connecting the dots to what you just said, which kind of makes a lot of sense. And we're seeing this evidence in our own programs with Coursera Career Academy, which is adopted by a lot of universities and governments. And the reason why they're doing it is because it's got about 30 different industry micro-credentials from Google included, like Google Data Analyst or Google UX Design or IBM Data Analyst, and so on and so forth. But what it is it's a credential that you can, as an individual, it doesn't require prior college degree, prior work experience. And also includes full hands-on learning as part of the credential, so you can actually gain all the skills that are relevant for the job. So then the imperative becomes like, well, how do we take this further? And I think that's where sort of this public and private partnerships become really important. And I think as I think about this unlock that can happen through skills-based training, so I think integrating a lot of that sort of the industry micro-credentials into sort of the educational experiences is one side of the equation. But the businesses embracing skills-based hiring. And I think if for this to work, because of the fact anybody can actually learn these skills businesses should open up and actually say, I want to hire based on the individual skills and abilities to do the job versus pure degree as such, right? And so for this to change, obviously, you have to have a collaboration between government and industry and higher ed.
So what is the role then of institutions, universities, high schools? I mean, given what you're saying, it changes.
Absolutely, and I think one of the big things that we are noticing here is actually integration of these micro-credentials into actual curriculum. To your point, exactly. We're working with a number of universities around the world through Coursera for Campus offering, wherein they're actually taking these 30-odd professional certificates, and they're kind of calling them as career electives. So essentially, these are digital skills that are mapped to the jobs of the future. And so while you're in college, you're getting the breadth of the education, which is great. And I think the other important thing that you said was human skills. And I think if you're going through an academic institution, I think it's a great place to gain those human skills. And I think the academic institutions can continue to focus on that and build on it. But they need to integrate this industry credentials and industry type skills that are also going to prepare these kids for the jobs of the future.
Thank you. Melanie Parker, did you see new people, different people coming into jobs? Did you see the results of, this first discussion we're having about, including people with different backgrounds? Did you see that?
I do, and I love the conversation that we're having. I mean, if you think about, we can all recognize that there's one part of job descriptions that has changed. Like many companies now have, in lieu of degree, or a 4-year degree is not required. But what does it mean if you don't require a degree? How are you going to solve for that? So one of the ways at Google that we've tried to solve for that is through our career certificates. And so if you are non-degreed or you don't have job experience, or say you've been out of work for a while. Say you were a caregiver, and as an example, and you're coming back in and you need relevant skills. How are you going to make that pivot? Well, the career certificates allow you to take a self-paced course, so the ability to have self-paced learning, motivate yourself to do that. We use Coursera as a platform. But once you get that certificate, you're eligible not just for roles at Google, but at 150 other employers now accept that. So, that's a way that we can contribute to society, ensure that everybody has access to employment, because the statistics say that the higher paying jobs require a degree or a certificate to do that. And so how are we going to close the economic wealth gap? And so that's the part that we play from a corporate standpoint.
Right. I just had a couple data points to what you just said. We did a survey, Coursera survey of over 50,000 learners and over 800 employers across the globe. And 90% of the students said the industry micro-credential or career certificates actually enhances their ability to get a job. On the other hand, 76% of the employers actually said, we would hire someone who has an industry credential as a preference, because they're starting to see these learners are making an effort to gain more skills and qualify themselves for the jobs. And so that certainly is exciting. The other point, you just said Google's kind of hiring skills-based, which is exciting. And in the same survey, we found 97% of the employers said they would be more open to skills-based hiring. Now, proof's in the pudding, obviously, right? But it's going to take some time.
But it does say, we think about who's taken advantage of the courses that the certificates we offer. 55% are from minority or women are taking these courses, and so it's an opportunity to increase more diversity. If I think about what we're doing in India as an example, we have a program called DigiPivot, and we are doing digital skilling for women and to have careers in digital marketing. And so we're helping women gain entry, but also with skills that continue to close the economic wealth gap.
Thank you. I want to give you the floor. How can policy makers? What is the role of policy makers? We've been talking of partnership, private, public. So, what is your opinion about your role, and how can you ensure that people have the good information, We're talking here of some elements, but you have to know about that. So how do you see that? What is your work?
Thank you. We see the role of policymakers, and we like to shorthand it in Singapore as the 4 A's. The first A is about awakening, and it's about really encouraging the behavior of lifelong learning as a social and industrial norm. It does not always come as a given, and we are very thankful for the work of WEF and so on, really to push the message that it is not. Let's not look at things like generative AI, metaverse, what have you, as a threat to your job. Let's look at this as an opportunity for growth. And so I think that's an important narrative that the government, the state, has to sort of promulgate. The second A, actually, I would say the fourth A, because there are 2 A's in between. The fourth A is about activation. Now, I think different countries do it in different ways. But when I say activation, I mean being able to provide the resourcing to enable the sort of the post-formal education infrastructure to take place. In Singapore, we do it with a mix of demand side and supply side funding. Demand side is in we give everyone a little bit of credits to do lifelong learning, but we also subsidize on the supply side the training providers. So that's activation. Now the 2 A's in the middle, I come to them later because they're the hardest things to do. Yeah, the second A in this case, I'm confusing myself, is about skills articulation. So you have to, after you awaken the interest to acceptance of lifelong learning, you have to be able to articulate what are the skills that the job market, that the labor market needs, because the man in the street will say, well, I get it, thanks for nagging me to upskill, but upskill in what? I know generative AI, I know, I've read the reports, but I'm an accountant, I'm a cab driver, what am I supposed to do? So this part about articulation, being able to say, well, here are some causes, here are some skills, here are some sorts of job experiences that may be helpful to you, that part is important. And this part we do it with, we have some capability within my agency, but we also do it very closely with partners. We see Coursera as a potential partner, for example. They're out there.
So it's information.
Information, intelligence, and gathering there at the national level. The third A really is a tough one. We call it aggregation. And it's about how do I get companies, industry sectors to come on board, to adjust their workplaces so that these are learning environments as well, to be able to look, as Google has done, across the sector and say, look, we need certificates to allow a much larger diversity of people to enter the workforce, and not just for Google, so how do I get more companies to do that? Because not all companies will do that. Some because they have other priorities, and some because they are not Google size, they are SMEs, and it would be a little bit of a stretch to think that they'll be able to mount something like that on their own. So how then do I aggregate the requirements, the needs of different companies, and get them on board this? Because at the end of the day, for all this, the first 3 A's to work, the employer must be on board. So I think that's where I'll end.
Thank you. I would like to, yes, perfect, please. We have a microphone somewhere. Let's just wait for that so that people online can hear you.
Well,
no. Thank you.
I'll keep it at a distance. Dr. Sally Saba from Medtronic, medtech industry. Love what Google is doing. We have also done the re-credentialing jobs in order to take away the 4-year degree. We're all about it. We've done it for 60% of our IT jobs. Here's the backlash. The backlash is the rest of our employee base that's saying, I paid, and I'm still paying student loans until today for my degree that allowed me to get this job. And now you, through your equity agenda, are going and saying, I'm going to open this up to them, and they don't need that. And honestly, we haven't had a good response to that. So when, sir, you were saying, how do you get companies to really buy into it? I think there's a lot more appetite in companies to do that because we understand the value, the access to talent. But there are real other issues to get that middle management layer to get your people buying into it as well when they have a personal stake in still paying student loans when they're in their 50s.
And the history, obviously. So, do you want to start?
Yeah, can I just? I mean, that's a wonderful point, and I would say that the struggle is not just at the company level; it could be at entire industry level, and in different jurisdictions. I'm not so familiar with this, but in different, say, healthcare jurisdictions, you have discussions about what the nurses can do, or what you need a medical degree to be able to perform. What kind of medical operations. So those are real problems. But I would like to say that there are two reasons that we are looking at upskilling. And the first is, of course, this whole ambition, this whole aspiration to allow everyone to be able to, you know, as someone in my country said, to be a better version of themselves, regardless of their station. And that speaks to the agenda of equity, speaks to the agenda of open opportunities for all. The second reason is simply that the half-life or the shelf life of skills are just going so fast. And it's not a matter of, you know, I am dissing your degree, or it's not so important anymore. It is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of fact that new skills are constantly coming up, and consequentially, existing and old skills are becoming less important relatively. So there is a material value to this, and I think it is a hard message, but it is one that I think our workforces need to internalize.
One more point about this?
Yeah, just a couple points on that. I think that's a great question, a great point, just in terms of culture and how you can evolve the culture side of the equation here. I think the question here is like, okay, apply generative AI. 49% of all professional jobs are going to be impacted. 50% of their work is going to be displaced or impacted or exposed to generative AI. So now what? Okay, you talked about all these individuals, but guess what? Your job is at risk as much as those people's jobs are. That's one. Putting that aside, as a company, like, you want to be competitive in the marketplace. And if you want to be competitive in the marketplace, first of all, you want to be able to produce products and services that cater to a global population. You're not going to be able to build a global, kind of the products and experiences if your employee base is narrow, right? And I think by design, you want to actually have, so that would be one of my big points back to them is like, who are you serving? If you're serving these individuals, then why not have those individuals to come and help you build these products for you in the first place? Second thing is, you have like 10 positions to fill as a manager. All right, let's take these people out of the picture. Go fill these positions. Do it. Can you find enough talent in this world? No. Especially in these skills areas? No. So, the skill shortages and the fact that their bonuses are dependent on productivity of their teams are going to actually have to force them to kind of think out of the box as well, I think.
Melanie, do you have issues of that type of issues externally?
not to that same degree. As part of our racial equity commitments, we actually introduced a loan repayment because we heard the exact same thing. So we did introduce it, not for everybody, but for early career to help take some of that out. But one of the other ways, and I was thinking about this when I was listening to your response, is we also involve our employees in the upskilling. So with the program I mentioned in India, DigiPivot, 50 hours of their instruction are taught by Google. And so we use our own employees to help with that. But it builds that buy-in, that consensus. It enlarges the thought process as well. And so I think there are different components we have to employ here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Are there some other questions? Yes, please, here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Njideka Harry, I'm from the US, and have really enjoyed listening to the panel. As I listen through, though, I'm hearing a very employer-focused discussion. And, I'm sitting here thinking of the higher education institutions, like you mentioned. And our higher education institutions all over the world, are they not just broken? Are they obsolete? Are they a combination of both? In the US in particular, I can think of 3 ways that our students are learning through the educational system. One is pace, the other is goal, and the third is mode, right? Pace, we are creating a generation of young people that start out at kindergarten all the way to college. They don't have time to think, they don't have time to reflect, and they end up in college with high levels of anxiety, as we know. And then in terms of the mode of instruction, we are teaching young people to pass a test that robots too can pass, right? And so they come out with these skills that robots could have passed the same test. And then finally, kind of rearing what I would term kind of excellent sheep, young people who they have milestones, get a good job, get a good salary, but real meaning of life, things like fulfillment and purpose, are not measured. They're not impacts that we look at in the educational system. And so these young people have these jobs, but they don't necessarily have the fulfillment. So I guess as I sit down here and I listen to this discussion, I'm just concerned that our higher education institutions talking to the industry as much as probably they should be, so that we can come to some agreement on what really matters, which are the young people at the center of this problem.
Thank you very much. Great comment. I think, what about you, Minister, about this?
It's a great question.
Are the
It's a great
broken?
and interesting, courageous question, to be honest. I think, look, are they talking enough to industry? I don't believe so. I think one of the key issues that I've seen, and I've seen this across different universities, even like the Russell Group in the UK and the Ivy League in the US, I get feedback on concerns about assessments because of the presence and the ability of students to use generative AI. How can we test these students? And I mentioned this in a different topic, in a different session, where some universities, let's say in Australia, went back to paper-back testing. So I think it's on us or on the higher education system to at least improve our assessment. So you mentioned a very good point about smart sheep. We're helping them pass a test. Now, given that you have these new types of tools that can do these jobs easily for you, we should not be lazy to use the same forms of assessment we did before. So now it needs to be a way where we can assess students on their cognitive ability and not memorizing and not writing an essay that you can actually have AI write it for you, such as ChatGPT. So I think if we were to have a decision on whether higher education institutions are worth it or not, I think we really need to rethink not only the way we teach, but the way we assess. The way we assess has not changed for a very, very long time. That needs to be changed tremendously. And going back to the point that was mentioned previously about the difference between getting the skills or micro-credential for a job versus going to a 4-year degree. I think it really depends on what you're serving for. If you're serving the purpose of meeting a job requirement today, then by all means, finish high school, take a credential, and go get a job. But an investment in 4 years is an investment in my own development by interacting with other peers and by challenging myself. And you also get to do electives in other subjects. So I think the 4 years, from my perspective, are investment in my own development as a person, whereas a micro-credential is solving my immediate economic need for a job today. Not to discredit any, and I know that student loans are extremely expensive in the in the US, but there needs to be a balance between self-development and between meeting a job requirement. Today, they're a bit,
Split.
they're a bit split. They're not converging. They need to converge at some point.
I think plus 100 to what you just said. I think the way I would also describe is all about pathways. I think in terms of the industry micro-credentials, to your point, get to a job, not get to a massive loan as a starting point. But I think then, of course, if you want to continue to advance your career, there are options to go pursue degrees. But I think it's an interesting question on the way that the education system also has to evolve and integrate more employability as part of sort of that equation. Because I think the cost of education is rising like crazy, but the employability is also going down at the same time. And I think that's the real issue. If you can actually improve the employability of this, which means that you can actually produce more sustained graduates that can actually get jobs and that can pay for those loans, but also continue to kind of rise in the workforce. And one other example, I think, we've been working with the Ministry of Kazakhstan Science and Education, and they're doing something very interesting. They've basically created a nationwide initiative to address the digital skills gap. And I think that's the other recognition that university systems have to have. But sometimes funding is a problem. And so this ministry is basically buying it for 20,000 students and faculty across 25 public universities. And they've prescribed about 650 plus different STEM, digital, human skills to be courses for credit. And I think that's the other way. Like, I think you can get a degree, but you can actually get a degree in a smarter way as well.
And I think what you're saying is the student is caught in the middle, because employers are looking after, like, what skills do you need? And then academic institutions, are looking like what's needed to progress and get that credential, but who's looking after the fulfillment of the student? Small example, but there are two programs that we have at Google that I have found to be incredibly successful. One is Googler in Residence, where we actually send our own Google employees to campuses, but specifically minority-serving institutions. So our historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges, and Hispanic-serving institutions, and they teach freshman computer science. But they're giving like that real-world experience, not just to the students in that class, but to the computer science department. They're in the computer lab. They're mentoring other people. But then conversely, we have a program, Faculty in Residence, where we're bringing faculty to our campuses in the summer so they too can get that real world experience. Because I agree with you, we're not talking enough on both sides of it to understand both sets of experiences. So I think there are other ways and we're an opportunity-rich environment to do more.
I think there's always a tension between the role of the higher education institution is rigor and its consistency in teaching things like the principles of economics and Newton's three laws and things that don't change regardless of generative AI. And there's a place in that, in the education of a human being, right? Yeah. And the tension of the industry who says, well, hang on a minute, he doesn't know what I want him to do. He can't operate this machine. He can't code in the language that I prefer, things like that. So it is not an easy tension to manage. And as the minister, you said, the thing to avoid is to have a complete bifurcation. I think as all institutions they're made up of people. And one thing that recently in Singapore we try to focus more on is the exposure of the teachers themselves, of our polytechnic lecturers and so on, and whether a stint in industry allows them, to continue their work, but to color, the teaching of the principles of economics and Newton's three laws or what have you, with real life experiences, with what the industry is doing and so on. And hopefully that adds a bit of balance to what the student is receiving.
Just one point I want to add.
We'll take
on
some
that.
other questions after.
Oh, sorry.
Please.
No, I was just going to add, ultimately, you also need to drive down the cost of education, right? I think it's the cost of education means then you actually can deliver the cost down to the actual student as well, so you don't charge as much. So affordability and flexibility, and by integrating a lot of other content and credentialing that can actually reduce the amount of burden on the academic institution to a certain degree as well. So I think we also need to think of why is it costing us so much today, and how can we actually reduce that burden? Online, hybrid, virtual experiences. This generative AI on the other side could actually be a personalized coach, personalized tutor, and a TA and a grader, all kinds of things that can actually reduce the cost of education as well.
Thank you, sir. Please. So you're going to replace professors now. Is that it?
No, it's completely augmenting.
Okay.
Anything is about augmenting and supplement.
Hi, Rob Rashad from Canada. I work for a high-tech company. We're about 13,000 people. We do a very similar type of program that Google does on a much smaller scale, obviously. I'm a huge advocate for micro-credentialing. I think it's the future. We could get into a big philosophical discussion about that. And we also very much have micro-credentials, not just for our company, but for our technology, for industry. Here's the problem. When Google does that, you have the brand recognition. People know that you're putting out micro-credentials that are quality. If even a small percentage of the company my size, the tens of thousands of companies that are my size, if they start putting out micro-credentials, I think, number one, we're going to make HR's job really, really complicated. And we're going to have a huge nest of all of these micro-credentials that no one's going to be able to make any sense of. If you go anywhere in the world, you can be pretty sure that an electrical engineering degree is going to be pretty similar. But these, what could evolve as just this rat's nest of micro-credentials. The government of Kazakhstan, I think, was a great example. So first question, are you seeing more initiatives like that, where there's some sort of consistency or structure around them? And does that worry you on a bigger scale if there isn't some sort of standardization of these career paths and the quality of these micro-credentials?
Great question. Thank you. So would we have a United Nations of credentials? Like, so what's...
I can start. I'm sure the rest of the panel can easily add to it. So on the first question about sort of the amalgamation of micro-credentials, I think what kind of baselines to me is skills. And I think every particular job has certain skills at a certain proficiency level that are attached to be able to do that job, as you can imagine, right? And I think so fundamentally, no matter what micro-credential it is, if it is tied to a Google IT support professional cert or IBM data analyst or SAP technician, the Salesforce sales development representative, et cetera, all these different types of certificates, they're actually tied to specific job roles at an entry level. And they're starting with what skills are required for this job to be done. And then they're actually figuring out, like, okay, all of the different components of teaching those skills. But I think the other important question that you talked about, like, well, how do I know this individual has the skills? Like, if they're all coming from different pathways. I think the skill-based assessments have become very important and interesting aspect of this. And so we've been piloting this new concept called Course Hiring Solutions over the last few months in India. And there are employers that are starting to use this solution to actually test and assess based on skills, first and foremost. And Axis Bank is one of our customers that actually recruited data analysts from Tier 2 and Tier 3 universities in India, which they probably would have never gone to. So I see a lot of hope. Now, clearly there's a long way to go, I would say. The second question on the examples, we're definitely seeing that. I think India is one of the most, I think, at least thinking forward here by making policy changes. So their national education policy actually incorporated up to 40% of the credit for any degree could be offered through online or alternative means. They're still asking for an assessment at the end of it, so just to be sure like you're getting that before you give the credit. But I think that's a very progressive policy. And so that encourages academic institutions to actually have that flexibility as well.
That's a great question, and we struggle with it. I can think of two solutions, but neither of them are straightforward. The first solution is we actually do have a system of institutions that do quality assessment. They are called the higher education institutes. And so if you link micro-credentials with the qualifications given by a university or a polytechnic, there you have it. You have the recognition, and no polytechnic will take a lousy micro-credential and recognize it. The question there is, what incentivizes the higher education institution to do that? Because in a way, they are disrupting themselves. They are saying that this module need not be taken in class, taught by my lecturers. It can be done at your workplace. Right. So how do we get the incentives to align? That's one. The second solution is if you don't want to go to higher education institutes, you go back to the government. So the government becomes the one that says, well, that's a good company. I will trust its micro-credentials. And, it may sound a bit undoable, but if you look at, for example, what the UK is trying to do with the apprenticeship system, that is what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, this company, good apprenticeship, you pass my quality management. So it's possible and it's doable, but I'm afraid going down that path will end up with something quite bureaucratic, and that comes from bureaucrats. So none of them are straightforward, but just to put it out there.
We just have a few minutes left.
Sorry.
Is there one more important question you would like to ask? Yes, please, sir. And then we will wrap up. Maybe you can think about one example you want to give.
Alejandro Poiré from Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. And this is a question about skills-based hiring and whether you have evidence already or what the perspective is for the growth of these employees that are hired based on these skills in terms of their ability to grow into middle and higher level management, because that goes back to your point about, well, some of it is self-investment. In a sense, it's investment towards higher leadership positions, it seems to me. But I don't know if we have already some kind of evidence that tells us, well, these people are actually going to grow within the company, or maybe not. So just a question.
I will, and maybe you have some other stats, but through Grow with Google, we've graduated over 300,000 who work across the 150 plus companies, and we do track what they're doing. Some come in, avail themselves of like education or tuition reimbursement programs. They go in and get other degrees, but become like fully, they're taking advantage of the progression that's available to them. And I think that's the ability to come in and make immediate contribution. I think we need more time to get like more information about what the progression path looks like all the way through like executive leadership. But I think the early signals are very strong.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things to that. I think we did a learner outcome survey. We always do this. And we just did this one back in March. And when we polled these professional certificate learners, 28% of them said they found a job after completing these professional certificate of the completers, right? And so that's a starting point. I wouldn't say that's the evidence in all by itself, but that's very encouraging to kind of actually see people going through this alternative mechanisms are getting employed. So employers are starting to recognize that. I do think the bigger opportunity is to continue to help upskill these individuals once you're inside the organization. And I think that's where we hear a lot of the organizations are focused on. But I think the question really is, are you taking a skills-first approach to not only hiring, but also training the individuals inside the company? Or are you just kind of checking the box and saying learning is a perk, learning is a benefit, and we need to do that because everybody else has it, right? So I think that's what I would ask the enterprises to kind of actually investigate and then kind of continue to build the pathways. Because what I do hear is a lot of employers are focused on internal mobility. And you have a lot of these frontline workers or even workers that, their jobs are getting digitized or automated. And you can't just keep firing and then hiring. And so actually we heard from people who have done the layoffs and who have done the hiring freezes. Well, where do you go if you're frozen for hiring? Like you have to train internally to kind of move them into still the requirements that are emerging in your company for those other kinds of jobs. So that's where I think there's going to be a forced necessity, I would say.
Thank you very much. We just have 2 more minutes, and I would like to wrap up with you and ask you, 4 of you, to just conclude with the key to success. We see there's a lot of issues, but there's also a lot of good intentions, a lot of things happening. So what are the keys, in your opinion, to success? Could we start with you?
Oh, okay. Oh wow, that's a big question. So we have only 2 minutes. I will need probably 30 minutes to answer that question.
One.
No, I'm just saying I'll just give you
one, the most important.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things coming out of the findings for us from this report, which is individuals without degrees are able to gain skills required for the jobs of the future at the same pace as with degrees. And so that gives a great platform for individuals out there, but also companies to look for skills-based hiring, and then institutions like governments and higher ed actually combining and participating to create and open the doors.
Thank you, Melanie.
I think the partnership between government, higher education, and corporations are critically important, and we have to cement that even more. I think that's evident by this discussion.
Thank you very much.
I think, look, we're at a cornerstone of very, very interesting times. Previously, we had academia clear-cut, and then you have skills clear-cut. Right now, universities are becoming much more skills-focused. You have credentials right now that are becoming a bit more academic. So I think as a success, you need to think of both as becoming more overlapping and create pathways for different people, because not everyone will do a 4-year degree, and not everyone will just do one course. There has to be mobility between both tracks.
I think one of the things that surprised me was the inherent interest among people, especially successful people, to want to teach others, to want to mentor others. During COVID, we ran a train and place programs. We got companies to train people to place outside of their companies. And we asked, are your employees happy with that? And sometimes the answer is no, they love it. If they're not happy, they love it. They love to mentor people. Yeah. And I guess the key to success is to be able to unlock that in your company, unlock that among the successful professionals. And this is one way to give back. And how do we do that together as government, employer, and as a public?
Thank you very much. So obviously the partnership is one of the words coming out very strongly, as well as thinking out of the box. You also had the 4 A's, I'm sure you noted them, and all this to avoid creating some excellent sheep. So thank you very much. You have the Future of Jobs report. You can look at it here. You have it, the QR code. Thank you very much for your participation, as well as the